And thank you for coming out on this rather rainy and gloomy day. Glad to see you here this morning. So the theme of this month, I am informed, is omnipresence. God's omnipresence is something that we affirmed in our meditation this morning. Each one of us has a deep connection to that power and presence within us. The opportunity to be open to it, to be lived by it. Not one of us is alone and separate from the source of all good, the answer to all our needs. God's presence is not only within each one of us and with each one of us, but it permeates all of creation. We are blessed to live in a God-infused universe. How then do we experience this omnipresence of God? One way to become aware of God's omnipresence is through grace, that upward pull of the universe that lifts us to the heights of our divine nature. This morning, we're going to explore how we can relax into the ground of grace. And to start our journey, I begin with the question, what is grace? It's such a beautiful and simple word that tends to lighten our mood and inspire us when we think of it. All of us have a sense that we have been touched by grace. Yet what is grace exactly? It's not a thing, something that we can touch, even though we feel touched by it at times. It is not something that we can see, even though we can see the effects of grace in our lives and in the lives of others. Grace is not something we can perceive with our senses. Grace is not an emotion, although grace may produce many emotions in us, even profound states of being. It is not a thought, nor is it a sensation in our body. So grace is not something that we can intuit through our three centers of intelligence, our body, our heart, or our mind. Grace is beyond the usual categories of objects and sensory experiences that we have access to in order to navigate the world in which we live. To find the realm of grace, we need to look deeper. Grace is a subtle quality found in the deepest places in our hearts, woven into the very fabric of our consciousness. Its presence is unmistakable, and we have learned to recognize the sensory signals that let us know that we are in the proximity of this mystery, which is always present, supporting us, guiding us. Rumi described it when he said, something opens our wings. Something makes boredom and hurt disappear. Someone fills the cup in front of us. Grace is the living presence that allows us to access the qualities of our true nature, our highest self. There are 4 aspects of grace that I want to call to our attention this morning. First of all, grace is a way of experiencing the ground of our humanity. When we are present and able to be with what is, exactly as it is, without judging it, without resisting it, without trying to fix it or deny it, we come to recognize a deeper layer of our true self that is here in the background, regardless of whatever we are experiencing. We know this part of ourself by many names, such as the divine, the higher self, our essence, the truth of who we are. A second aspect of grace are the gifts that it imparts. We have experienced the tremendous blessings and benefit that come from contact with our higher self. It is a huge relief and delight to discover the gentle and expansive qualities of our essential nature. Grace holds our difficulties with patience, compassion, and loving kindness. We learn to trust and rely on this fountain of benevolence that is always available, even though we are so often oblivious to its work and existence during our daily routines. Yet in a breath, in a pause, in a single moment, when we are willing to notice and sense into the deeper layers of our being, this miraculous quality of blessing is always present, waiting for us. This brings us to the third aspect of grace. When we allow grace to do its work in us, it transforms us, both psychologically and spiritually. This aspect of grace can be seen in this metaphor. We can think of grace as a bridge between our small ego self and the divine that expresses each one of us. Grace brings light and compassion to our pain and difficulties and turns them into something that assists our growth. Grace gives us the capacity to be with our experiences so that they can be digested and integrated into our soul's greater purpose. And finally, grace helps us to live our realization, allowing us to reach our full potential in every aspect of our outer life, in our work and in our relationships. Grace helps us to live in two worlds at the same time, our inner world and our outer world, and ultimately to see that they are really one. We learn to embody the essential qualities of our divine nature and discern the meaning of Jesus' advice to be in the world, but not of it. We find blessings in the small events of daily life. We see the miracles that fill our days. We recognize the preciousness of our journey, of our relationships, and of the people who are in our lives, and learn to appreciate every step of our journey as we take it. This rich, exquisite experience of humanity is available to us every moment of every day, with every breath that we take. Why then do we not avail ourselves of it? What is required to relax into this ground of omnipotent grace? As it turns out, our active attention attracts the action of grace. When we become actively receptive, consciously inviting the divine awareness in us and around us to do what needs doing, our life unfolds in miraculous ways. This is not an epiphany. This is a practice of surrender. Grace always requires some kind of surrender, what the Indian traditions call dropping the mind into the heart. There are so many illusions that we have about what to fear, about what we can control, about what is wrong with us and others, that must be surrendered in our practice of attracting the action of grace. When we surrender our illusions of fear and control, when we are open to being vulnerable, it is then that we can be touched by grace. Brene Brown, in her latest book entitled Atlas of the Heart, explains that vulnerability is the emotion that we experience during times of risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. When we are willing to practice vulnerability, our defenses soften, and we can connect with ourselves and others authentically in our common humanity. We are also more open and receptive to the divine life that is within us, and we can be touched by grace. This connection with the divine allows us to take the next step in attracting the action of grace. With this divine support, we can create a non-violent inner world. Shamsuddin Mohammed Hafiz is one of the most beloved poets of the Persians and is considered by many from different cultures to be one of the 7 literary wonders of the world. This story, translated by Daniel Ladinsky, which comes from The Subject Tonight is Love, gives us a powerful metaphor for what we are going to explore this morning. Once a young woman asked Hafiz, "What is the sign of someone knowing God?" Hafiz remained silent for a few moments, then looked deep into this young person's eyes and said, "Dear, they have dropped the knife. They have dropped the cruel knife so often used upon their tender selves and others." Dropping the knife distills one of the most important practices of attracting the action of grace: the need to disengage from judgment, both projected judgment and internalized judgment. All of us are probably very well acquainted with the piece of ourselves that we call the inner critic. It's that part of us that insists upon judging ourselves and others. It can compel us to second guess our every step by saying, not enough, not good enough, and sometimes, whoa, way too much. We see the effect of this inner critic in our lives and in the lives of others. I was enjoying lunch with an esteemed colleague of mine several months ago. She is one of the most accomplished people I know, and has received many awards in recognition of her numerous contributions to our profession. She seemed a little down and shared with me that she was struggling with a letter she had received from a well-meaning relative that she just couldn't shake off. It was a lengthy, written critique of why she had not landed a long-term relationship and offered well-intentioned advice on what she should do to become a more successful person in this and other areas of her life. This critique had latched its claws into my friend's own inner judgment, the place inside where she felt most vulnerable. Despite her obvious intelligence, her accolades, her awards, her recognition, she was under attack from within, desperately fighting the feeling that there was something wrong with her and that she must work harder to fix herself, even though she knew this was not fair and not true. Sadly, this is a common experience, and I would imagine that each one of us has struggled in this way, probably several times in our life. The knife of judgment wielded by our inner critic has touched us all. Since the inner critic is a part of our psychological structure, we have no choice but to learn to live with it. Learning to dance with our inner critic is a constant practice, and I would like to share 4 strategies this morning that can help us to disengage the inner critic and create the nonviolent inner atmosphere needed to attract the action of grace. Strategy number 1, recognize the inner critic and name it. In order to dance with the inner critic, it is necessary to recognize and accept it as a knowable part of life. If you are a human being, you have an inner critic. Recognizing it can require some practice, however, because often the inner critic appears disguised as a helpful voice that just wants to protect us. It can often appear disguised as our own inner guidance. Realize that the inner critic operates on all volumes. Sometimes it operates quietly, just under the radar. At other times, it's easy to recognize because it's very loudly insistent. And because it is often the loudest of the voices within, it is easy to assume that it's right. But don't be fooled. The inner critic becomes active when we are operating on automatic, when we are not present. That is, when we are not questioning, recognizing, and naming it. Anytime the word should is delivered with a tight energy, know that the inner critic is at work. So just recently, in fact, just this weekend, I named my inner critic. I've been working on this step for quite a while, and I hadn't found a suitable name. But my husband, who desperately wanted a puppy, got his way finally. I put up a big fight, but finally wore me down. We live in a condominium that doesn't have backyard, and I've had many dogs in my life, and I know how this works. You put the dog in the backyard, you forget about it, you bring it in and enjoy it, then you put it out in the backyard. Real simple. Well, I knew that wasn't gonna work in our situation. So anyway, we've got this cute little Cavachon. Stands, he's a tiny little thing. He's maybe 26 pounds, stands about 2.5 maybe feet tall. So he's a little dog. So anyway, his name is Bo, short for Boaz. My husband named him. So that may explain. Those of you who know, my husband and I have taught some courses here before. He's a rabbi, and so he likes the name Boaz and likes the character Boaz. Well, anyway, I'll take Bo on a walk. So we're in our condo, and we're on the younger end of the neighborhood there. So you kind of get an idea of what this condo's like. We downsized when our youngest, became independent and went on his own. So anyway, I'm out walking Bo, and so we see Jacques, who is a full-grown poodle, stands very tall and majestic. Jacques is minding his own business. He could care less that Bo is there. Bo sees Jacques. Every fiber in his being comes to attention, and he starts his barking. And his bark is a very high yip. So he is barking. He is gonna take Jacques down. That's all there is to it. So I realized, that's what my inner critic does to me. It stands there, it barks, it yips, it's gonna take it down, it's gonna take me down. So now I call it Bo. And every time I do that picture that I just described to you, Bo comes to mind, and it helps me to disconnect. It gives me a little distance from that inner critic. And so that's the first step. Learn to recognize it and find a name that works for you to create a little distance. The trick is, though, with the inner critic, is that it can also multiply itself. It's the part of us that judges the judge. that judges what I just told you to do. That is, even when you notice that you're wielding the knife of energy against yourself, the inner critic can jump in and judge you for judging yourself. You may also notice that just under all of this mental activity the inner critic produces, there's emotion, usually negative emotion. We often feel fear, apathy, resignation, anger, shame, sometimes even guilt when the inner critic is active. Learn to sit with these unpleasant emotions when they arise and recognize that it is not you who are inadequate. You are perfect, whole, and complete, just as you are. It is your ego which is inherently inadequate because it's based on a false sense of yourself, of who you are. So name the critic by calling it out. I often say things like, "Oh, really? Thanks for that useful piece of information." Think of some sarcastic phrases and see how effective they can be from disengaging from your inner judge and its critical barbs. So strategy 2, once you have this distance from your inner critic, you can vary your communication style. One effective way to communicate with your inner critic is to exaggerate its judgment. So if you are hearing, "Wow, you were such a jerk," from your inner critic, meet it with, "You are absolutely right. I am a complete and total jerk. In fact, no one is a bigger jerk than me. I am at least 1,000 times worse than anyone else." If you're skilled at exaggerating, you will find yourself smiling or even laughing at the absurdity, and that's the whole point. Rather than arguing with the inner critic, move with that energy, making it bigger and bigger until it becomes completely ludicrous. It puts the initial statement in quite a different framework. Another effective way to communicate with your inner critic is to agree with it. This is especially effective when you are moving into new territory and that voice in your head says, "You have no idea what you're doing. You're insane." The inner critic is actually right on track here. The truth is you don't know what you're doing. How could you? You are completely in new territory and you're on a trust walk. So agree with your inner critic. You're absolutely right. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm choosing this because this is what I must do. Communicating with your inner critic is to learn to dance with it rather than to let it control you. Strategy number 3, meet the inner critic with humor. Mark Coleman offers this strategy for dancing with the inner critic from his book entitled Make Peace with Your Mind, How Mindfulness and Compassion Can Set You Free from Your Inner Critic. Mark Coleman shares, "In my workshops, I make it a point of bringing humor and levity to the subject of the inner critic. I will often tell a story about how you can't win with the inner critic as a way of pointing out the humor of it. For example, you might set the alarm early in the morning because of some noble intention you have. Maybe you want to get up and meditate, or maybe you want to go for a run, or maybe you want to do some chores that have been piling up before work. When the alarm goes off, the inner critic, disguised as your life coach, whispers in your ear, it's early and you're really tired. And they say it's really important that you get enough sleep." So you press the snooze button and hit the pillow for another hour. Then when you finally wake up, what happens? The inner critic gets on your case. This time, not as your friendly life coach, but as your inner tyrant. "Why didn't you get up when that alarm went off? How come you can't follow through on things? Why don't you ever exercise in the morning? You are never going to get in shape." Just another thing to add to your list of failures. So you see, you're doomed if you listen, you're doomed if you don't. You can't win. It is important to see how often, when it comes to the inner critic, it is a no-win situation. So it's helpful to see the humor in it. I've already mentioned that noticing and naming the inner critic provides some space to dance with it. Mindfulness also provides space, the space needed to see the humor in the inner critic. If we're too close, too identified with the critical voice inside our head, we get caught up in judgments and suffer unnecessarily. It is the space of awareness and non-identification that gives us perspective to see irony in our human condition. We can take a tip from the comedians we have seen. They use humor to point out our foibles and quirks, and we're not offended. Instead, we laugh. We can do the same with our inner critic and point out its idiosyncrasies. One way to do this is to make a joke of your not-so-perfect habits, which the inner critic would usually chastise you for. So many of you know that I'm a math professor at Columbus State Community College. I will confess that even after earning my master's degree in mathematics, I can't do simple arithmetic very well. I often make simple arithmetic mistakes when I'm teaching a class. Instead of allowing the inner critic to chastise me for this imperfection, I tell my students on the first day of class that in order to keep them engaged, I will make arithmetic mistakes, and it is your job to find them. After all, it's not fair for me to do all the work. So this is not abdicating responsibility. This is all about not getting yourself down on yourself for the small things in life and the peculiar quirks of your nature that will most likely express themselves. Those very quirks are what make each one of us uniquely human. Listening to all the demands of your inner critic and engaging in the never-ending quest to be perfect are not the solution. In a comic strip called Rhymes with Orange by cartoonist Hilary Price, there's a cartoon entitled The Checklist to Feeling Pathetic. It depicts some ways we sadly and comically wield the knife of judgment on ourselves and make ourselves feel terrible. In one caption, it says, "Think of all the people you regularly disappoint, especially those who share your last name." Yes. My favorite caption says, "Relive embarrassing and awful moments that occurred years ago." When we find the humor in our inner critic, we take its judgments less personally. We can join the human race and connect with others in our common humanity. We can see that our mind is a little crazy at times and that it's okay to wear that lightly. And that brings us to strategy number 4. Pay attention to your heart. When the inner critic is active, it's easy to lose contact with your heart. The negative judgment of the inner critic can ignite big emotional reactions that can send us spiraling down into a pit of despair, far removed from being connected to our heart's energy and intelligence. More than a strategy, the practice of bringing your attention directly to your heart supports your commitment to attract the action of grace. Connecting to the sensations and energy of our heart helps us to be open, kind, and receptive to ourselves. Our heart center provides the entryway into our inner truth and has a gentling effect on the harshness of the inner critic. When we change our focus of attention from the activity of the inner critic to this potent center of love and compassion, we are offering a soothing balm, a medicine that allows us to harness our active attention, which is needed to attract the action of grace. When practicing the surrender that is required to attract the action of grace, it's easy to get caught up in seeking grace, while not recognizing that we are already in and part of it. Perhaps you've heard the term non-duality, which literally means not to. Non-dual awakening is important because it dissolves separation, ending the search for grace, for love, for peace, and for freedom. It restores the awareness that we are and always have been in and part of everything that our heart desires. Non-dual awakening means not only tasting grace, but also recognizing that you are grace. You cannot talk yourself into this. You cannot intellectualize or theorize. You can only enter more deeply into your own direct experience and surrender. Then the mystery that has been living in you all this time has space to come freshly alive. Wherever you find yourself right now on the path toward the ground of grace, just be as you are. Rest in knowing God, right here, right now, with whatever is occurring in this moment. There is nowhere else you need to go. There is nothing you need to do. May we allow grace to bring infinite richness and meaning to our life and deeper peace into our troubled world. May grace become our way.